Someone like you signed up for special ops training? Good with paperwork maybe, but how will you handle the intensity? A chorus of laughter erupted across the training ground as the petite woman in workout gear stepped into formation. She didn't react, just stayed silent. But when she pulled off her shirt after physical training, a tattoo on her back was revealed. The V13 unit symbol that only those who'd been on Black Ops missions would know. The commander walking by froze without saying a word. Aria Kellen, 30 years old, small frame, brown hair pulled back, formerly an administrative coordinator but signed up for the internal training program. In the eyes of young soldiers, Aria was just an office worker. First training session, obstacle course running, pull-ups, static shooting. A sergeant laughed. "Hope your wrists don't break when you climb the rope." Another female trainee whispered, "People like her should just stick to keyboards." The training ground buzzed with casual cruelty. Aria had arrived early, quietly checking her equipment while others gathered in groups, already forming the social hierarchies that would define the next several weeks. She wore standard-issue workout gear, but everything about her seemed smaller, softer, less intimidating than her fellow trainees. "First day nerves?" a muscular recruit asked with mock concern. "Don't worry, they usually wash out the desk jockeys by week 2. Aria adjusted her water bottle and said nothing. She had learned long ago that responding to provocation often made situations worse. Better to let actions speak instead of words. "I heard she's from the administrative wing," another trainee said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Probably thinks this is like those corporate team-building exercises." The training instructor, a grizzled staff sergeant with 20 years of experience, called the group to attention. "Listen up, people, this isn't summer camp. Half of you won't make it to the end of this program. The other half will wish they hadn't." During the initial fitness assessment, Aria's performance was adequate, not impressive, not terrible. She completed the required push-ups, though her form wavered near the end. She finished the 2-mile run in the middle of the pack, breathing hard but not collapsing. "Not bad for a pencil pusher," someone muttered as she caught her breath. The obstacle course was where things got difficult. Aria struggled with the rope climb, her hands slipping on the course fiber. She made it over the wall, but took longer than most. During the tire flip exercise, she fell behind the group, her smaller frame working against her. "Come on, Kellen," the instructor shouted. "My grandmother moves faster than that." Laughter rippled through the group. Aria gritted her teeth and kept moving. She had faced worse than mockery before, though these young soldiers had no way of knowing that. "Maybe you should consider a transfer back to filing," a particularly vocal recruit suggested. "This clearly isn't your thing." Aria finished the obstacle course last, mud on her clothes and fatigue in her movements, but she finished. She didn't quit, didn't complain, didn't make excuses. CTA Comment Act 1. Have you ever seen someone publicly mocked for looking weak? Type, "I've seen it." During the physical training portion, Aria fell twice and was required to remove her jacket to continue the heavy running exercise. She said nothing, just complied. When she turned her back, a black tattoo on her back was clearly visible. The code V13 Silent Night, wrapped around a half-drawn sword. The entire training ground froze. The training commander, Lieutenant Colonel Rylan, was walking over when he stopped dead in his tracks. "Stop. That tattoo. Who authorized it?" "Aria. It was inked after a mission 9 years ago. Team V13 doesn't exist anymore." The colonel took a sharp breath. "You're Kellen, Silent Dagger, the rear guard from Shadow Echo?" The revelation hit like a physical blow. The laughter died instantly, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that seemed to stretch across the entire training facility. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. Lieutenant Colonel Rylan had been in the military for 25 years. He had seen classified files that most people would never know existed. He had worked with special operations units, whose names were never spoken aloud, and he recognized the tattoo on Aria's back because he had been part of the command structure that had authorized those missions. "V13, he said slowly, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet training ground. "Silent night operations, Shadow Echo Theater. The trainees looked confused, but the other instructors were beginning to understand. A few of the senior non-commissioned officers were exchanging glances, recognition dawning in their eyes. "Ma'am," the colonel continued, his tone completely different now. "I need to verify something. Can you confirm your operational designation?" Arya straightened, and for the first time since arriving at the training facility, she looked like something other than a small administrative worker. Silent Dagger, Reconnaissance and Rear Guard Specialist. V-13 disbanded following completion of Shadow Echo operations. The colonel nodded slowly. "The mission reports were classified above my clearance level, but I remember the outcome briefings. Your unit, there were casualties." 7 KIA, Arya confirmed. 3 wounded, 2 successful extractions. "And you were rear guard, last out." The young soldiers were starting to understand that something significant was happening, even if they didn't grasp the details. The woman they had been mocking was having a conversation with the base commander that was clearly above their pay grade. "Silent Dagger," the colonel repeated. "I remember that call sign from the after-action reports. You held the defensive position while the rest of the team extracted." "For approximately 7 minutes," Arya confirmed, "until extraction was complete. The 7 minutes might not sound like much to civilians, but everyone on the training ground with military experience understood what 7 minutes of rear guard action meant. 7 minutes of being alone, under fire, holding a position while your teammates escaped, 7 minutes of being the last person standing between your team and whatever was pursuing them. The tattoo," the colonel said, "it's not just a unit identifier, it's a memorial." Arya nodded once. "For the 7 who didn't make it home." The training ground was completely silent now. Even the most arrogant recruits were beginning to understand that they had been making fun of someone whose service record was beyond their comprehension. "Ma'am," the colonel said formally, "I need to speak with you privately. The rest of you continue your training, and remember, you never know who you're serving alongside." CTA Comment Act 2. Have you ever thought someone was weak, then saw they carried an entire past on their back that you wouldn't dare face? Type, I was shaken. Arya had been a special operator responsible for reconnaissance and rear guard in V-13 unit, participating in Shadow Echo Operation Deep Forest. No backup, no satellite data. In the final withdrawal, she stayed behind alone for rear guard, holding off the enemy for 7 minutes while the entire team escaped. She was later wounded in the shoulder, requested withdrawal from front lines, and transferred to internal operations. No one remembered her real name because V-13 unit files had been sealed. Lieutenant Colonel Ryland confirmed through private channels, then stepped out to announce, "The person you just mocked is someone who once saved a complete SEAL team. And that tattoo, no one can order it online." The trainees stood at attention, one person crying as they realized their arrogance. The private conversation between Arya and Lieutenant Colonel Ryland lasted 20 minutes. When they returned to the training ground, the atmosphere had completely changed. The colonel's face was serious, almost reverent, as he addressed the assembled trainees. "I want everyone to understand something," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen real combat. The V-13 unit designation was classified at the highest levels. The missions they undertook were so sensitive that most of their operations were never officially acknowledged. He paused, looking at each of the young soldiers in turn. Shadow Echo was a deep penetration reconnaissance mission in hostile territory. No air support, no backup, no extraction guarantee. The team was inserted with the understanding that they might not come home. Arya stood quietly beside him, her expression unreadable. The woman who had been struggling with obstacle courses an hour earlier now seemed like a different person entirely. "The intelligence they gathered saved hundreds of lives," the colonel continued, "but the cost was significant. Of the 12 operators who went in, only 5 came out. And the reason those 5 survived was because of the actions of one person who volunteered to stay behind." The young recruit who had been most vocal in his mockery was pale now, understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. Sir, what exactly happened during the extraction? Lieutenant Colonel Ryland looked to Arya, who nodded slightly. The extraction point was compromised. Enemy forces had anticipated the team's route and set up an ambush. The helicopter couldn't land, and the team was pinned down. Someone had to provide covering fire while the others moved to a secondary extraction point, Arya said quietly. The position required someone to stay behind and hold off pursuit long enough for the team to reach safety. 7 minutes, the colonel emphasized. 7 minutes of sustained defensive action against overwhelming odds. No backup, no support, no guarantee of extraction. The math was brutal and simple. One person, holding a defensive position against an unknown number of hostile forces for 7 minutes. In military terms, it was an eternity. The after-action reports, the colonel continued, described it as one of the most effective rearguard actions in modern military history. The enemy was convinced they were facing a much larger force because of the tactical skill displayed. A female trainee raised her hand tentatively. "Ma'am, how did you survive something like that?" Arya considered the question carefully. Training, preparation, and a lot of luck. But mostly I survived because I had a job to do. My teammates were depending on me to buy them time, and I wasn't going to let them down. The shoulder wound, the colonel added, happened during the final phase of her own extraction. She continued fighting even after being injured, until she could confirm that the helicopter with her team was safely away. The silence on the training ground was profound. These young soldiers, who had been laughing at Arya's struggles with basic exercises, were now learning that she had once performed acts of courage that most of them couldn't imagine. "The tattoo," Arya said, touching her shoulder where the ink lay hidden beneath her shirt, "isn't about me. It's about the 7 who didn't make it home. Every day I serve now is for them." Lieutenant Colonel Ryland nodded solemnly. The V-13 unit was disbanded after Shadow Echo. The surviving members were reassigned to other duties. Most of them requested non-combat roles. "We'd seen enough," Arya said simply. "We'd done enough. Time to serve in other ways." CTA comment, Act 3. If you've ever mocked someone, then realize they once held blood and covered an entire unit's back, write, "I am silent." Arya continued the training session, asking for nothing, showing no attitude. When a trainee asked, "Why didn't you speak up from the beginning?" she simply replied, "Because if I have to use a tattoo to make someone listen, then I'm not worthy of training alongside them." At the end of the session, the entire training ground voluntarily lined up to apologize and salute her. The transformation was remarkable. The same young soldiers who had been mocking Arya's performance were now watching her every movement with something approaching awe. But Arya herself seemed unchanged by the revelation of her identity. She completed the remaining exercises with the same steady determination she had shown before. Her pull-ups were still a struggle. Her running time was still average. Her obstacle course performance was still slower than most. But now everyone understood that her struggles weren't due to weakness or incompetence. "You're still recovering from the shoulder injury, aren't you?" one of the instructors asked quietly. 9 years later, it still affects my range of motion, Arya confirmed. "But I work with what I have." The young recruit who had been most vocal in his criticism approached her during a water break. "Ma'am, I don't know what to say. What I said earlier was completely out of line." Arya looked at him steadily. "You didn't know. You saw someone struggling and made assumptions. That's human nature. The question is what you do with new information. I want to apologize publicly," he said, "to the whole group." "That's not necessary," Arya replied. "Just remember that everyone you meet has a story you don't know. Everyone has struggles that aren't visible. Everyone has strengths that might not be obvious." But the young soldier wasn't the only one who felt the need to make amends. Throughout the remainder of the training session, other trainees approached Arya with their own apologies, their own expressions of respect and regret. By the end of the day, the dynamic on the training ground had completely shifted. The woman who had been an object of mockery in the morning had become someone to be respected and learned from by evening. "What's the most important lesson you learned from Shadow Echo?" a female trainee asked. Arya thought for a moment. That courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what needs to be done despite being afraid, and that the strongest people are often the ones who choose to serve quietly without recognition. The training session ended with an informal ceremony. Without being asked or organized, the entire group of trainees formed a line and offered individual salutes to Arya. She accepted each one with quiet dignity. CTA Comment Act 4. Type, "I will live respectfully." If you believe the strongest people are those who know how to stay silent and keep moving forward, there are people who once preserved entire lives for their teammates, then withdrew to the background with no one mentioning their names. They don't need recognition, but a tattoo on their back, once carved with blood and survival, is enough to make a commander stand at attention. Don't laugh at someone when they fall. You never know if they once stood alone, so you would never have to fall. The story of Arya Kellen was more than just a tale of hidden heroism. It was a reminder that service takes many forms, and that the most significant contributions are often made by people who seek no recognition for their efforts. In a world that often celebrates the loudest voices and the most visible achievements, Arya represented something different. She embodied the quiet strength of those who have been tested in the most extreme circumstances and emerged not with arrogance or bravado, but with humility and a desire to continue serving. The young soldiers who had mocked her learned a valuable lesson that day. They learned that strength comes in many forms, that courage isn't always loud and obvious, and that the person struggling beside you might be someone who has already faced challenges you couldn't imagine. Most importantly, they learned that respect should be given freely, not earned through displays of credentials or stories of past glory. Every person deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their apparent abilities or current circumstances. The tattoo on Arya's back wasn't just a memorial to fallen comrades. It was a symbol of the invisible burdens that many people carry, the hidden strengths that aren't immediately apparent, and the quiet heroism that exists in every community. Her story was a reminder that before we judge someone's abilities, before we dismiss their potential, before we laugh at their struggles, we should remember that we never know the full story of the person in front of us. The administrative worker might be a former warrior. The quiet teammate might be someone who once stood alone against impossible odds. The person who seems weak might be someone who has already proven their strength when it mattered most. Arya Kellen continued her training not to prove anything to anyone, but because she believed in the value of continuous improvement and service. Her presence on that training ground was a gift to everyone around her, a living example of what it means to serve with honor, humility, and quiet strength.